Hello, I'm Shaun Tan, here to talk about my new book with Walker Books called The Singing Bones. Oh, well, it had a very convoluted history. It started off as an assignment from a German publisher to do some illustrations for Philip Pullman's retellings of Grimm fairy tales, where he'd rewritten the stories and hadn't really modernised them, but kind of cleaned them up a little bit and fixed up some logical inconsistencies in the stories. And at first I wasn't really in a position to illustrate these books because I was doing some other work, but after reading these versions, I got quite excited about the project. I thought about doing something for Grimm's fairy tales throughout my career on and off, but it had always been a difficult proposition because there was something almost too strange I found about many of the stories, and I love the surrealism of them, but in some ways there's little things that happen, the way things are phrased, or logical inconsistencies that kind of disengaged me slightly. And it was very nice to then have these texts and be able to work with them. But the problem I had was that, as Philip had stated in his preface to the original edition of Grimm's Tales for Young and Old, that these stories do not benefit from illustration. That's more or less what he said. What he loved about the stories, and it's what I love about them too, is that they're really hard to illustrate. They work best in the mind of the reader. So everybody is a creative person. Every reader is an illustrator. It's a delicate act to illustrate anything because you don't want to interfere with the imagination of someone who's already creative. You don't want to conflict the image they have in their head with something that you're creating, which might be beautiful and elaborate, but at the same time, it's that house made of cake is not the house made of cake that they were thinking of before they came to that picture. The witch is either too scary or not scary enough. That's not quite the forest that the reader had in mind when they were thinking about venturing down a dark path. So Grimm's fairy tales are very much about flat two-dimensional cardboard characters sliding on and off of these sets which exist in our head, and they're very elemental and archetypal things. The moment you start to articulate them too clearly, they lose their magic. You know, they're kind of like campfire stories. The words are very important. So that immediately set up a problem, you know, when you've got a text where the author doesn't really feel that illustrations are necessary and the illustrator doesn't feel that illustrations are necessary. But I realised that throughout the centuries and even the millennia, people have been illustrating the same kind of folk tales very effectively, often using kind of folk art approaches, either naive painting but especially sculpture. And I've always been a massive fan of Inuit carving. Ever since I was a child, and a primary school teacher gave me a lump of soapstone and said, why don't you have a go at, she knew I had this artistic inclinations, why don't you have a go at carving this very soft rock? And I loved it, and it sort of did lead me to an interest in Inuit carvings. And subsequently, in my professional life, I've had the opportunity to travel to Mexico a couple of times, and I was very impressed by work in the anthropological museums there, and you know the how modern these little pre-Columbian clay figurines are, which makes sense because so much of modern art is pilfered. So-called primitive art, there's nothing primitive about it at all. It's very advanced visually. And very restrained, highly educated in its approach to storytelling, and really narrative, with the ability to combine, especially with a lot of Mexican folk art, horror and humour, you know, that Day of the Dead stuff. Which is one reason I really wanted to have a skull on the cover of the book, because it just has that strange mix of skulls, almost sort of something a little bit scary and a little bit funny, but intimately human. And with this original assignment, I said, you know, could I try doing some sculptures for the book, the German book? And the publisher was a little bit reluctant, and I was a bit reluctant, but I gave it a go, and I love the experimental approach. And after that, and after working on that particular edition, I got carried away and I wanted to do a lot more sculptures. I kind of got hooked. So I ended up with 75 sculptures in the end. At some point I just stopped. But there's 200 stories, so who knows, maybe there'll be a second volume one day. But it was just so nice to read these stories, which were very different to anything I would imagine myself. And also to have that kind of collaboration with something so old. And of course I grew up in Western Australia, which is so far removed from the forests of Europe. I was just actually walking through some forests recently in Switzerland and thinking, so this is what they're talking about, but it's not what I could imagine growing up where I did, reading these stories. So I don't know if that affects the kind of work, the fact that I'm coming at it from such an odd distance, but I think that can only help because I'm taking nothing for granted, nothing about wolves and foxes for granted. They're kind of almost fantasy creatures for me, or something from dreams. And it's just it's been possibly the most enjoyable project that I've ever worked on, which is saying a lot because my books are pretty enjoyable, but I had so much fun with this. I almost felt a little bit guilty, like this work can't be any good because I'm just having too much fun. But I think I hope that infects other readers anyway, that they, I do have a theory that if the creator's having fun, then the reader probably will too, and they'll get as much out of it. So hopefully that's the case.